You're listening to The Gulf Stream, the official podcast of the Harte Research Institute at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi.
Welcome, everyone, to Season 3, Episode 1 of the Gulf Stream podcast. I'm your guest host, Jay Kleberg with the Gulf Trust, and I'm here today with Sarah Schlessinger, the CEO of Texas Water Foundation. And we're going to talk about water, specifically water in Texas. I grew up not too far from where we're recording this podcast on Baffin Bay and the Laguna Madre, and feel like, having looked back on my life, that I've followed water for the last 30 or so years, from Baffin to the tributary to the Amazon to the Grand Canyon, and not really until taking the CEO or executive director role of the Gulf Trust did I realize how important freshwater is to the Texas coast specifically. Can you tell me a little bit about your background and what drew you to water?
Sure. First of all, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for having me on Episode 1. Love it. Well, gosh, I think like many people, I found myself working in water through a series of coincidental actions and a very few strategically placed investments. I actually started off really interested in looking at development theory and working in the global south. So like you, spent time working abroad in West Africa, in Haiti. And it was through that experience that I recognized, well, really, that my root of fascination with water was how people interact with it. Ultimately, over time, of course, I have a deep appreciation for the way that ecosystems operate and contribute to our well-being. But the root of my fascination started with looking at people and how societies develop. And I think that is part of what drew me into water, was realizing that how we manage, how we allocate, how we interact with water tells us a lot about who we are as a society. And so really the path to water to me was through people. And
interesting that that's what led you here, because if we look at population growth in Texas and some of the recent reporting about drought and water supply conditions, that Texas could see severe shortages by 2030 if conditions continue. And we don't do anything about it as a state. So in Texas, why is water so important? Because we've both worked in areas where water is abundant, and maybe there's a different relationship with water, but certainly in Texas, with the recent floods, with droughts over the last few decades, why is it so important in Texas?
Well, gosh, there's so many layers that we can peel back, right? Maybe let's start from a global perspective, or maybe even a historical perspective, because where and how communities have developed around the world have often had to do with where water was and where it wasn't. Great civilizations of history have risen and fallen based off of water availability. And I think that Texas finds itself in a moment right now where it's having to contemplate its success based off of the resources that it has available. So why is water so important to Texas? Well, first of all, I think that Texas's history and identity is shaped by water. It's unique. I think often about the unique shape of Texas really being informed by the fact that 3 of its major borders are the shape of water, that natural fluid shape. Its economy is very driven by water, always has been. Where our communities have settled has often been because of where water was or where it wasn't. And so, I think that the question of why water is important is it's everything. It's the root of our communities, it's the root of our economy, it's the root of our vast and precious wildlife and landscapes, and so it's everything.
And for those who either may not be impacted or they don't perceive that they're impacted by water because they don't live near a river, or they're not on the coast, or maybe they haven't experienced severe drought. Maybe they're in East Texas. They have a different relationship with water. can you kind of set the table for where we are as it relates to whether you want to call it a crisis or not, but kind of where we are with water and both its availability and also how you think about water resources, because I think you know so much about how it hits the landscape and where it goes once it does hit our landscape in Texas. It'd be interesting for people to kind of understand how you think about that.
Sure. I find myself often referencing the water cycle when we start to have this conversation, right? So for those of us with technical backgrounds in water, I think there's a tendency to realize how localized any particular water system can be, right? So you can look at the circumstances of a particular community, or you can look at the circumstances of a particular region. Where policy and governance comes into play is when you zoom out and you start to look at the patterns at a statewide scale or even at a federal scale, right? Which also has an impact on where Texas is right now. And for an everyday Texan, what I would suggest is thinking less about a water crisis and the contemplation of a water crisis in terms of water availability, because many of us will experience the perpetual drought and then the disastrous and often tragic flood that happens in between, but thinking rather about this concept of risk. And risk can be water availability. It can be enduring drought. It can also be flood. It can also be the lack of environmental flows. And it can also be things like aging infrastructure and the lack of efficiency and the lack of investment. And so I think that as a state and as a nation, and even in many parts of the world right now, we're starting to think about this concept of water security in terms of risk. How much risk are you experiencing at any given time? And one of the ways that I think is interesting to think about this is our reservoirs, also known as lakes in Texas, right? That people interact with and recreate on. Those are reservoirs with our drinking water, right? And we often hear about how full a reservoir is at any given time relative to where we are in the season. And so if we're going into the summer and our reservoir is only 40% full, and we have a very dry, hot summer, that's a very high risk threshold, right, in terms of having sufficient water supply. If, however, we enter the season with 40% and we have a very cold and wet summer, would be delightful to have one of those,
right,
then the risk is much lower, right? And so I think it's less about this static arrival point at a certain amount of water or a certain lack of water, but rather what are all the conditions that are making it so that we have more or less risk?
Yeah. And can you connect water, explain groundwater and surface water and maybe some of that interaction? Because I became more familiar with water in Texas a few years ago with
Texas
Water Trade and involvement there, and really didn't understand that interaction. And then also you mentioned something, environmental flows. So kind of what we understand at least of where water goes. You know, you talked about the water cycle, and something I hadn't even thought about since maybe whatever that is, 8th grade or 9th grade, is we get a certain percentage, 10 or 15% of fresh water that ultimately lands via rain or snow in Texas or other parts of the country from our ocean. So they're important as well because of that.
They are.
But maybe that interaction, that groundwater surface interaction, and then what is environmental flow and why should we care about that?
Sure. Well, if we conjure that image of the water cycle that we're all so familiar with, right? It's part of that. That was one of the very effective, I think, cornerstone educational moments for us as kids, is that everybody remembers the water cycle. And so from that, what we know is that when we have precipitation and it falls, it then contributes to an ongoing hydrological cycle that then feeds into either contributions into your aquifers or into your streams or into your rivers or into your reservoirs. It evaporates back up, and there's this ongoing cycle. Of course, here, when you're looking at an ecosystem that includes coastline, you're dealing with a really significant contribution to how weather patterns and how our sea surface temperatures are interacting, right? And so all of this is contributing not just to our water availability, but also how we're moving resources about through different parts of the ecosystem. So as it relates to surface water and groundwater, it's always challenging, Jay, because every aquifer is different, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about these things as kind of broad platitudes as like groundwater and aquifers, but there's so much nuance to the type of aquifer, the type of geology, the way that water moves through. So thinking about the water cycle, something that's unique in Texas is that the way that we manage and the way that we regulate and even the legal premises of the management of surface water and groundwater are different. And specifically, surface water is owned by the state and held in trust for the public, and it is provided to us in the form of permits through a prior appropriation legal model. And then groundwater is considered a private property right, which is then managed through a legal construct called rule of capture. So there's moderated management through these groundwater conservation districts. And the challenge in that is that the two, groundwater and surface water, regardless of which aquifer or which surface water, interact with each other. They necessarily interact with each other. And right now, there is very limited coordination and management between those two systems. Now, previously, when these management regimes were created, there was less pressure on either surface water or on groundwater because Texas' population was not as big as it is now, right? And the biggest pressure point on the entire water cycle, on the concept of water security in Texas, is really population growth and where that population growth is occurring and what that then means of the systems that are supporting it and which systems it's then going to pull from as well. So I would encourage folks to think about, even if you don't want to get into the nuance of legality and ownership and governance structures, to really just think about the ripple effect of as you have more population growth that puts more pressure on, let's say, an aquifer, more wells, it will then impact the spring systems around it. It will then impact the environmental flows, which you brought up, right? Which is the ability then for our surface water bodies to make it all the way down to the coast and feed the extraordinary ecosystems that are right here, and that are so crucial to the overall environment.
That also have, and again, a lot of this stuff was new to me over the last few years, is you have these historic flows and a salinity gradient. So you've got water from the Sabine that's reaching the coast, and then you get all the way down to the Rio Grande, which has historically not had as much flow, and you've got an area between Corpus and Brownsville that traditionally Laguna Madre has been more saline than other parts of the Texas coast. And so when we think about environmental flows, as you said, with that interaction between groundwater and surface water, and depending on the aquifer, it really depends on the region that you're talking about in Texas. But it has an effect. If you're in Austin or you're in Lubbock or you're in El Paso, what happens there with that water ultimately impacts the Gulf and this coastal ecosystem, which is critical to not just us here in Texas, but to the rest of the Gulf.
Rest of the Gulf, rest of the nation. I mean, the economic impacts, of the vitality of the Gulf. Yeah, I mean, the scale of these things is always interesting to contemplate because, again, the impact to water and the way that you manage, the way that you allocate can be so hyper-local, and yet the way that you big picture think about the allocation, the movement, the investment in infrastructure can have regional and statewide impacts as well, right? And so it's both always, and that makes it even more challenging. Yeah,
and then you layer on what you just discussed, which is this regulatory framework, which doesn't necessarily, whether it's federal or state or local, it doesn't necessarily always match the actual flow of water, if you will. Can you talk about the regional issues? What we see in Corpus may be different from what's happening in East Texas, not just the water issues with quotation marks, but also what the potential solutions that we're contemplating.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I should have included in the intro is that I I have really spent the bulk of my career interested in governance and policy. And I think often it's important to differentiate. There are people who have technical backgrounds in water, hydrologists, hydrogeologists. There's a broad range of specialists that are working at a very technical scale. You also then have a number of engineers, right, that are scoping out projects and how strategies are developed. You also have lawyers that are looking at the legal constructs. But whenever we talk about water security, I find myself often feeling inspired to encourage people to think differently around solutions as being a governance issue as opposed to a technology issue or a scientific issue, right? There's a tendency for people to think that, well, if we just develop this innovative solution, it will solve things. But the truth is that water security is more a function of how people choose to value a resource, the awareness that's brought around it, and then how they govern around it. And so governance is the biggest challenge. So then when you look at Texas as a whole and you think about the pressure points that are different in a place like Corpus versus a place like Austin versus a place like Amarillo, what you're really looking at is some of the broader socioeconomic dynamics. You're looking at supply and demand curve changes. You're looking at the socioeconomic impacts, right, to different industries, and they are necessarily different because of the landscape. So my background is I'm a geographer, technically, and that means that I'm interested in time, place, and people. And where Corpus is right now, both knowing the resource that it has to steward and where it sits in terms of its economic role that it plays, and I would imagine probably is not seeing the same type of population growth that Austin, Dallas, and Houston are seeing. Not as familiar with the exact trend lines, right? But they're probably seeing an increase in pressure around the amount of water that's needed to sustain certain activities, but also a change, perhaps not as rapid an increase in population growth. And the reason why that's important is because the way that we fund water infrastructure, not just in Texas, not just in the nation, but in most places, is through the water rate. So when you and I pay our water bill at home, we are contributing to the overhead and the maintenance costs of our water infrastructure. And that means not just the pipes that are leading it to our house, but the treatment costs, the workforce behind it, the innovative strategies, or even the low interest loans, hopefully, that they're taking out to maintain systems, right? So that's all contributing to how we finance. So so in places where you are seeing either the same or decreasing population, but an increasing demand because of a change in water availability, one of the challenges that they have is how do they finance the investment that needs to occur, not just so that they're stable, but so that they're making efficient use of what they have, as opposed to a place like Austin or anywhere in the I-35 corridor or Texas Triangle growth pattern where they have this boom in population. They have to think. Their challenge is about which water management strategies and which supplies are they going to finance to make it so that they are secure, as they have this astronomical supply curve, right, that is dramatically outpacing irrigation by 2050. It's going to be that municipal demand. But they have a different way of being able to finance it because they've got a ratepayer base. And then their challenge is affordability. And their challenge is, well, which water supplies are they drawing from? Right? So there's a red thread in the challenge. Everybody's going to have a supply issue, whether they're in an area that it rains a lot in East Texas or not. Everybody's going to have a risk issue because even those areas that previously had a large volume of water, surface water, groundwater mixed, are going to find that their risk is increasing because they also have aging infrastructure and they also need to diversify and invest in that. And so I would say that, the red thread across Texas right now is that people are having to confront, even if they're not aware of it, how we finance water infrastructure and how we reduce risk. And those are philosophically complex issues.
That's a good segue because that was a huge conversation. I mean, it's been a conversation for years. I remember someone showing me a map of Texas from, you may have seen this from the mid-'80s, that shows water pipes all over the state.
From every state.
Taking water from different states and from East Texas, et cetera. So we've obviously been thinking about this as a state for a very long time.
We have.
This legislative session, we seem to actually make some decisions, or at least move in a direction where we're thinking about funding at the state level for water supply. So I think this fits in with what you were just talking about, is supply, demand, risk, and funding, and trying to match that up with all of those demands on communities and the water resource. Can you talk about the legislative session a little bit and what you saw there?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm gonna preface it by saying another important element of water security and of water infrastructure financing is that water is and will always be an economy of scale issue. Right. The financing of critical water infrastructure is really high, and the per unit cost of production is relatively low. And what that means is that there is necessarily a tendency towards centralized infrastructure. The economics of that make more sense, right? The way that we pay out, and the United States and Texas has benefited from large investments that happened at the federal scale 50 and 60 years ago. So a lot of the water infrastructure that we still benefit from was subsidized by those large federal investments, which really did not occur again until the recent Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, right? And so that kind of course corrected decades of a lack of any attention, any investment. So now we're at a place where we have aging infrastructure. A lot of that infrastructure is at the end of its useful lifespan, high inefficiency. So as we're talking about supply issues, we've got communities that are losing 20%, 30%, 40% water loss, right? So that there's necessarily leaky pipes. That's right.
Yeah.
This session did a brilliant job of characterizing water loss, which is a technical concept, into leaky pipes. Nobody wants leaky pipes. And there's also a need for new infrastructure and new water supply. So this legislative session was really confronting the importance of water infrastructure and the lack of financial capacity from the state to address those needs. Now, there's a little bit of nuance to it, right? Because the result wasn't, and I'll tell you about the nuances of what was approved, but the result wasn't the state is simply going to grant and invest billions of dollars in. The state created a fund from which individual communities can take out low-interest loans. And that goes through the state agency, Texas Water Development Board. And that's fairly consistent. And it is also smart. Texas has done a remarkable job of setting up really sophisticated financing structures for water. The problem is, and this is what this session addressed, is that most of those funding programs were 8, 9, 10 times oversubscribed because the demand was so high that it was outpacing the money that was available in these individual funds. So Texas Water Development Board as a state agency is non-regulatory. They do the funding, so they act as a bank. They do planning. They do our state water plan, and they used to do it top down and contemplated maps where there were pipes coming in from various places. And then in 1997, they switched the model and they made it a ground-up planning process. So now it happens within 16 different regional water planning groups, and they look at those supply and demand curves, population and industry demands and ag demands, and they come up with strategies. What strategies are they going to use to close that supply-demand curve or gap? And then the board receives all of that, compiles it in a state water plan, and then has a fund called the SWIFT Fund, State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, that allows them to apply for low-interest loans. Well, so it's not just free money, right? You're still financing it through rates,
right?
But there has to be, but it's incentivizing communities to be able to advance some of those strategies. So, last legislative session, we talked about water infrastructure. I would say we brought awareness and light to the importance of water infrastructure because it's largely invisible.
Yeah.
It's very hard to make pipes and wastewater systems sexy because it's, they're pipes, they're underground. So last legislative session really brought attention to this concept of water infrastructure and the fact that there were leaky pipes. And they created out of that the Texas Water Fund, which was approved by voters on the ballot through Prop 6, and that was last session. This session, they contemplated and passed for the first time a dedicated revenue mechanism for the Texas Water Fund. So the Texas Water Fund sits as this umbrella concept, which then distributes funding to a variety of programs, including the SWIFT, including the Flood Infrastructure Fund, really important this summer,
right,
including ag conservation grants, right? So there are various programs. And specifically, the legislature approved the allocation of $1 billion from our sales tax revenue.
Okay, so this is existing sales tax. Okay,
correct, exactly.
Not
so it's
a new
not
tax.
not a new tax, not new fees. Now, this still has to be approved by voters.
Can you
in
talk
November.
about that as we transition to break? Can you give people an idea of what they can do? I mean, sometimes it feels like it's so complicated.
It is, yes.
But it does come down to individual action this fall, and people will have an opportunity to vote on this. Can you talk about that?
So this fall, they're going to find a number of constitutional amendments on the ballot. This is not a high voter turnout election. And one of those is going to be Proposition 4, which is specifically to authorize the $1 billion allocation to the Texas Water Fund, which was previously created.
And Sarah, is that $1 billion in a year, or is it $1 billion over a period of time?
That's right. It's $1 billion a year over 20 years. So the way that joint resolution was drafted is that it's sunsetted after 20 years, but really just to give them an opportunity to revise it, to reassess it. Now, zooming out, this is not a new concept. The way that we fund our roads and bridges, critical infrastructure, again, that all of us participate, is exactly in this manner. There's a portion of our sales tax that gets allocated into a fund, as you know better than anybody, right? That gets allocated to these different. So this is just following a similar path as we do other statewide critical infrastructure. And I think going back to the beginning of our conversation, that is in part because water has never felt as valuable as it does now.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there is now pressure and understanding around water supply, population growth, aging infrastructure, the variety of socioeconomic and industry impacts that this has, is turning people's awareness and leadership's awareness, legislators' awareness to how important it is to prioritize dedicated funding. So I think the question in terms of how there's a very obvious opportunity for people to contemplate that decision in terms of the constitutional amendment.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I would say the opportunity is really for Texans to reflect on and to identify ways to say water security is important and that they are willing to invest in it over a long period of time. And that really takes a values shift in the way that people have previously thought about a resource. And I think that we're at a really interesting place right now in Texas, regardless of where you live, where how we value water is going to materialize in a number of decisions, such as bond elections, approving investment in water infrastructure, who you are voting into office, how you are choosing to develop your communities, land use regulations, dare I say. And so I think all of those are examples of where Texans will be able to lean in and have a conversation around water security and the types of decisions that are being made, regardless of whether they are engaged in direct advocacy or with the grassroots organizations, but even on a very practical scale at their utility level. What type of strategies are they adopting? What type of strategies are they financing? And what's really neat about Texas is that the way that we govern, the way that we manage, is actually is constructed to allow for public participation, even though most Texans don't realize that they have an invitation to do that. But there is an opportunity to participate in regional water planning, to participate at the utilities, to participate in your groundwater districts. So I think there's a lot of ways that Texans can participate, but really the root of that is, do we value water and water infrastructure? And we should unpack what infrastructure is, right? Because I think that sometimes that gets misunderstood, sufficiently to invest in it.
Right.
Whatever that means, right? And I think that's the big moment that we find ourselves in.
It's a huge moment. If you think about the history of Texas, and help me out here as far as the details go, but you look at things like the hurricane that hit Galveston, flooding in the early 1900s, and really investment in trying to control water and its devastating effects. I would argue that was kind of the story, if you will, the first part of the 1900s. And then you go through the 30s, 40s, and 50s with extreme drought in the 50s, right?
Right.
And this realization that it's not always going to be there. And so we need to build infrastructure not just for water availability and water supply, but also in some instances in the Highland Lakes to generate power for the hill country, for a growing population. And we happen to have a president from Texas, from the hill country. And so now, and there's a lot of stuff that's happened, between the 50s and now. But to your point, a lot of that investment that we see today that we're benefiting from was in the 70s.
Yes.
Like in the mid-70s.
That's right.
And we now have tens of millions of people in Texas that we didn't have at that time with skyrocketing growth. And it's not just, someone asked me, why do we need water? And I know it was theoretical. Like it was a question about why can't we just deal with the water that we have today? It was a question about new supply, right? Whether that's getting it from the ocean or brackish wells or conservation, whatever it is. But I think the real question was, it was kind of philosophical about where we're going as a state and this idea that we can continue to grow both economically and from a population perspective. But we have to invest in that, to your point. It can't just be solely at the local level. Like we have to have a larger mechanism to do that. And if I understood what you said, that is partly what we're voting on this fall, is at least a mechanism where the state doesn't have to always rely on federal funding, that they can rely on existing sales tax revenue. This isn't a new tax.
That's right, existing.
And so people have a chance to get engaged in that. And then you mentioned it, but can you say a little bit more about, so much about water. I think people are learning more, but wherever you are in Texas, how can you get involved in this, whether you want to learn more or you want to actually participate?
Well, gosh, we need to unpack everything you just said because there's so much depth and
so many
much
errors.
So much, so important to think about it from the historical arc. Mm-hmm. Because first of all, you are absolutely right. So much of how we have interacted, our relationship. I mean, that sounds very. Our relationship with water has been very influenced by the weather patterns, by what we've experienced generationally, what the context was. And we are in a very new chapter for Texas. So in the early 1900s, you had a series of catastrophic floods that then turned into the passage of the Conservation Amendment in 1917, which allows specifically a couple of things. One, for public entities to be created to build the infrastructure to safeguard, right, the responsibility to plan for the future of Texans and their safety. And two, for those entities to be able to take on public debt in order to do so. I mean, those are two of the big important outputs that came from the Conservation Amendment. So when you think about today's river authorities that generate electricity, that manage and control our rivers, thinking about things like flood, they have the ability to take on debt because of the response that Texans were feeling after tragic and catastrophic floods.
This is the Lower Colorado River Authority, Guadalupe Blanco River Authority.
Right.
All of those
Brazos
were created
at
that time. Okay.
Yeah, and so there was kind of a generation where suddenly Texans were thinking about, we should be managing to protect us from risk. And we should have the ability to finance or invest in those systems.
Yeah.
And then flash forward again, you're right, 1950s, terrible drought. All of a sudden, that kind of coincides with the proliferation of better technology to drill and pump groundwater. And so all of a sudden, there's this huge amount of groundwater that's available, and there's a need to manage it, right? And to manage it out of the drought that they're experiencing. And so you had the state water plan starting to come out in the 1950s. You had the first groundwater districts being created then. So and then flash forward again, the late 90s. I mean, all of these are responsive to floods and to droughts. And what's different, I think, about right now is that while there are on the surface these pressure points of population growth and industry, the fact that Texas has the 8th or 7th, I lose track, strongest economy in the world, driven by industries that are very dependent on water, we're suddenly contemplating, is there enough? And how are we diversifying, and how will we have more supply? So to the next part of your conversation around desalination versus, these various strategies, I encourage people to think about water supply and water strategies as interconnected but slightly different things. Your water supply are things like your groundwater, the ocean that's right next to us, right? The rainwater, things that are in our surface water bodies. And the strategies that you use are things like desalination or reuse or brackish desalination or aquifer storage and recovery. These are strategies that we use to manage, treat, and distribute. And then there's, treatment facilities as well. And then you're getting into the technical pieces of it. But the reason why that differentiation is important is because right now you're going to hear a lot of conversation around us needing additional supply. And that is true. For most communities, they need either additional supply or they need to reduce their risk because they're reliant on a singular supply. Yeah. A number of our Rio Grande Valley communities are singularly dependent on the Rio Grande, and that is no longer a reliable water source. A number of our rural communities across Texas are singularly reliant on groundwater. And that is very, very high risk, particularly as you see those aquifer levels declining as we endure long droughts where people are then predominantly using groundwater and pumping from it. So then the strategies that we get to use are ways that you diversify that risk. It's ways that you can treat, store, develop, and those strategies are really expensive, right? Particularly when you're talking about things like desalination. And desalination can be kind of a third rail for a lot of people, right? Because there's it's very context specific and it's very governance specific as well. Desalination is just a technology. It's a filter with a lot of pressure moving through it where you're removing a certain amount of TDS out of the water, right? Yep. The same thing is used in West Texas where you have brackish groundwater, you're using a desalination process. And the same thing is probably used for produced water as well. It's just a filter is a filter is a filter. It's just how tight is the membrane and how much pressure is going through it. But the scale at which you're producing and the cost of that production and the energy consumption in it is going to determine how viable of a strategy it is for any particular community, which goes back to our economies of scale, right? So a lot of these strategies that are available, which are good strategies, if they are governed correctly, if the right regulations are in place, if you have the appropriate workforce for it, are then just a matter of cost and how are you going to finance them. So I think that, beyond this constitutional amendment in the fall, where we're going to be talking about, do Texans value water infrastructure sufficiently to allocate $1 billion from our annual sales tax revenue into the Texas Water Fund to finance our water infrastructure? I think the question beyond that is going to be which strategies should be used, when, how, right, and in what combination. Yeah. And that is the good news is that there are a lot of people involved in that conversation. So there's a lot going on there, and I think there's still going to be a lot of interesting conversation well past this year.
Well, it's critically important as you have illustrated, and it's complicated, but I think Texans are going to learn more about not only its importance, but what they can do to learn more. They have a say in this, certainly at the local level as well, as you mentioned, with all of these different strategies. And I think we're fortunate in Texas to have people like you that are focused on this issue, continue to be, and what seems to be a growing interest in managing that risk and also figuring out a way to balance growth with resilience and sustainability and all of that. So any parting words of wisdom or thoughts, anything that maybe we missed?
Parting words of wisdom feels like a lot of pressure. I'm not sure how wise it's going to be, but
maybe parting words.
Parting words. We'll leave it there. While water security is something that all Texans should be paying attention to, it is a refreshingly bipartisan issue. I would say it is a challenge between our urban and rural communities, and that has tended to be the case for water in Texas. At the local scale, there's a lot of agency, and there is a lot of opportunity to lean in and to understand the exact nuances of what your water supply is. If you don't know your water supply, and I mean supply, not strategies, you should learn about it. If you don't know who is managing your water, and that is now the governance question. And so specifically, I would advise get to know who your utility is. If you have a utility, maybe you're on a groundwater well, get to know your groundwater district, get to know your river authority, get to know the state agencies. The state agencies, Texas Water Development Board, TCEQ, PUC, those are large and it's hard to wrap your head around. But at the local scale, it's a lot easier to start to understand what your local water landscape is and the humans that are interacting with it, because it really, I mean, my bias is that water is human in terms of how it's managed, how it's allocated. And so be thoughtful about the governance that is in place, be thoughtful about the workforce opportunities around it. That is a huge opportunity in Texas right now, is for us to think differently about what our water workforce looks like going into the future. And certainly be thoughtful about how it is that you're prioritizing it within whatever decisions you can make, right? In terms of communities that get authorized to build or not to build, and which industries move into your community. That is where the everyday Texan has voice and has the opportunity to lean in, and not all is not lost. Texas is remarkably ahead of the curve, not just in the nation, but really on a global scale, in the fact that we have been experiencing and thinking about these pressure points for much longer than other communities have, simply by the fact of our geography and our weather, right? Yeah. And so if I reflect back to my first exposure to water management, which was the middle of a cholera epidemic in Haiti, right? How people access water, how you finance water, how you treat it, how you distribute it, how you regulate it, tells you everything about the health of a community. And Texas has everything that it needs to do that well, both in terms of its economic capacity, but also in terms of its regulatory entities and its incredible research institutes, right? I mean, Texas has an extraordinary amount invested into its science, into its data. And so as opposed to communities or countries in the world that don't have that, Texas has all the tools in place, right? It's just a matter of governance. Oh, and sorry, last thing, infrastructure. We got to deconstruct that, because I don't want people walking away thinking that infrastructure is just pipes. Right. Because it's not, right? Yeah. Infrastructure is I think that infrastructure is having a moment right now in the sun where we think about that more as the systems that we use to access and distribute resources. So they can be pipes, they can be treatment facilities, it can also be data, it can also be workforce, it can also be these various strategies. So when you think about the Texas Water Fund opportunities on a local scale, and you think about the prioritization of water infrastructure, sometimes water infrastructure is public access to swimming. Right, that is infrastructure. Yeah. That is a public benefit. But we're at a moment where Texas gets to define how it is that it wants to move forward, and water is going to be at the root of it.
Well, I think that's a great way to sum it all up. We're on season 3 of the Gulf Stream podcast. This is the first episode, and one thing to sort of just bring it home for me, because I think visually, is every watershed in the state of Texas drains to the Gulf.
Sure does.
And so we're all connected by water, period. And I believe we're all connected by water ultimately to the Gulf because of that fact. And so thanks for being here, and we'll see you down the road.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, consider contributing to a greater Gulf by visiting harteresearch.org. That's HARTE research.org.